One of my favourite authors is Gaston Bachelard. I haven't read everything he's written, but I've read quite a bit of his stuff. He's just writes some really lovely pieces, actually. He did a psychoanalysis of fire, which is a kind of psychoanalytical reading of the symbol fire. He did a similar kind of thing in the one called Air and Dreams, and one about water that I can't remember the title of. But again, it's a kind of an interpretation of the way that symbols of water, symbols of air, symbols of fire are used, particularly within poetry, but not exclusively in poetry. But the one he's probably most famous for is Poetics of Space, and he wrote a later one which I read relatively recently, called the Poetics of Reverie. And those two, the Poetics of Space and the Poetics of Reverie, I think are different in really interesting ways, actually. The Poetics of Space kind of follows on from his other writings I've just mentioned, and it's about, it kind of takes various aspects of space, particularly domestic spaces, spaces inside houses, cellars, attics, other kinds of spaces inside a house, and runs a kind of analysis of the way those spaces figure, using poetry as examples, but the way they figure within our cognition, the way that they produce meanings, or the way they signify certain structured, organised meanings. And the example I've just given, the cellar and the attic, I think are good examples for that. He doesn't talk about it in the way perhaps someone doing a kind of metaphor analysis would talk about it, but it has some similarities. You know, attics are places which are clearly above ground, they're elevated, they're slightly transcendent, they're close to the light. The attic has those kind of properties, as well as the actual kind of functional properties they acquire from the way they're used within dwelling spaces. And cellars have a very different kind of gestalt, really. They are definitely subterranean, they are of the underworld. They are dark, they are much more kind of emotional and felt spaces. They kind of correlate with unconscious spaces and perhaps slightly monstrous spaces. And I'm just thinking about some of the news items we've had recently over the last couple of years, at least, about the fairly awful uses that cellars have been put to. And I think that's kind of part of that understanding. So the Poetics of Space takes these spaces, real spaces in real houses, completely embodied kinesthetic experiences that we all have, and then tracks them into their symbolic value. The other book I mentioned, the Poetics of Reverie, in a sense there's something similar. It still uses poetic examples. It does a kind of excavation of the terminology, the words that's used, the language that's used, the structures that's used. But with the Reverie, instead of talking about real embodied, kinesthetically available, sensorially available experience, he's really talking about metaphors, actually. So, for example, in one passage, he talks about the kind of journey that takes place between wakefulness and sleep as being a kind of movement downhill, down a slope, down an incline, as if the movement from wakefulness to sleep is this kind of slide down the hill, with reverie being a point somewhere down that slope that normally we would pass right through. You know, you go through this kind of hypnagogic, daydreaming, slightly hallucinatory stage prior to going underground and being in sleep proper. And here I'm reminded of the James Hillman book, actually, Dreams in the Underworld, which again, it basically uses the same metaphor as dreams being the lower slopes of this slide from the brightly lit uplands of consciousness down the slopes of reverie toward the possibly valleys, but maybe even underworld of dreams. But in Bachelard and the Poetics of Reverie, there is no slope. There really isn't. There is no kinesthetic experience of really going down a slope and pausing at the point of reverie. or really going underground. It's the Poetics of Reverie he's talking about there is the way we talk about reverie and the way we talk about different states of wakefulness and sleep as if it was a slope. So it's a kind of poetics of space applied to reverie. Kind of metaphorical mapping from our understandings of space onto the abstract domain of our understanding of sleep and wakefulness and states of consciousness. I suppose this is just reiterating what I was talking about earlier on in one of these videos, in which our kind of sensory experience, our embodied experience, our experience of travelling up and down hills, our experience of looking out into the world and seeing the brightly lit part at the top and the dark part at the bottom, the experience of moving towards night and seeing the darkness fall, those kinds of fully embodied experiences provide the templates for other forms of understanding, allowing us to understand and structure other forms of experience, like the movement. See, I can't even get away from it. The movement from wakefulness to sleep. I can only really think of that difference by thinking in terms of something like movement, or like something like movement down a slope, or like a darkening, or like a movement away from the visual sense towards something more tactile, perhaps. So I think Bachelard's doing my work for me in that one. Poetics of Space and the Poetics of Reverie are fundamentally different in that regard. Go on, Pete.